You find yourself in Italy in the year 1580. You are here to learn the art of fencing, the ultimate expression of masculine virtue in the Renaissance. And you couldn't find a better place to do so than the famed Italian school of fencing. But after stepping into the fencing school, you notice something is not quite right. The other students are all women. What happened? Well, it's probably for the best that you ask. Because if you had been here any time before 1490 or after 1630, you would have seen men only. Why is that? Let's step into the strange world of the 16th century Italian fencing schools and find out. To start off, let's talk about the basics. At this time, sword fighting was considered an essential part of any gentleman's education. So from the upper classes, young boys were sent off to fencing school at a very early age, usually between 7 and 12 years old. This wasn't like modern fencing, though, which focuses on athletic competition and sport. No, this was serious business. These were young men learning how to kill each other with extreme prejudice. The first thing that you will notice about these schools is their abundance of rules, mostly invented by the fencing masters themselves to help make sure no one got seriously injured or died under their watch. It was a necessary evil, since letting children run around stabbing each other as hard as they could isn't exactly a great advertisement for the school. In fact, many of these rules were written down in the form of fencing treatises, some of which have survived until today. One example is Salvatore Fabris's Il Fior di Battaglia, which details the rules of the staff and sword for the Italian school of fencing. Another famous treatise on sword fighting, one of the most famous in fact, is Andrea Alfieri's Verdadero Duello, detailing the Neapolitan style of sword fighting. However, he doesn't go into much detail about the rules of the school, likely because he didn't want them getting into the wrong hands. So what kind of rules did these schools follow? To answer that question, we can look at the fencing school in the fictional town of San Gimignano, where our unnamed protagonist has just enrolled. The bell rings, signaling the start of class. You put your wooden sword at the ready and turn to your training partner, a beautiful young woman named Isabella. You both doff your velvet fencing masks, revealing your faces. Your master calls for the bout to begin, and you spring into action. You lunge forward, extending your wooden sword towards her. She parries. You press the attack, but she holds firm. Finally, she makes a small opening, and you take advantage of it, scoring a touch on her shoulder. You hear the bell ring again and freeze in place. She removes her mask and smiles at you before bowing to Master Angelo. Master Angelo nods back at her and turns his attention to you. He tells you that you have lost the bout and sends you to the corner to reflect on your actions. You think back on the bout. Everything seemed to be going well until the end, when you made a simple mistake, an extremely common one. You used your left hand to support your sword arm. Swordsmanship was considered such an essential part of the education of a gentleman that it was important for a man to always be prepared to defend himself with a sword. For this reason, men were taught to always hold their swords in their dominant right hand and never use their left hand to support it. That was for peasants. Even if a man was left-handed, he would still only use his right hand for sword fighting and get extra training with his right hand to compensate. Not only were lefties looked down upon, but they were also considered dangerous, which is why there were special rules for fighting against southpaws. You remember Isabella easily countering your attacks because she knew that you were left-handed, and she had been trained to fight against it. It's almost too much pressure. Now, thanks to Master Angelo, you've learned a valuable lesson, and you get back to work with Isabella. You try again and again to not use your left hand while fencing, and every time you do, you hear the bell ring. Finally, you feel confident that you have mastered this basic rule and are ready to move on. But you notice something odd. All around the fencing school are pictures of St. George slaying dragons and other scenes of heroic knights doing battle with fearsome beasts. And in the center of the room hangs a painting of two knights locked in combat. Each knight wears the typical Italian garb of the era, complete with codpiece, and each is armed with a rapier and dagger. The more you look at it, the stranger it seems. Where are their shirts? Where are their hoses? They aren't wearing any armor except for their helmets. There are no spectators in the gallery either. This must be one of the masters who commissioned the painting. Angelo notices you staring and clears his throat. You quickly turn away, embarrassed to have been caught staring at a naked man. But Angelo tells you that there is nothing to be ashamed of. It was normal for Italian fencers to train naked. They believed that this helped to build character and virtue. Just as Greek and Roman youths were said to have exercised naked, so too did Italian fencers. It was considered a symbol of masculinity and strength. Not only were they willing to fight in nothing but their codpieces, but they also preferred to train without shirts, because it allowed for greater flexibility of movement. Angelo tells you that the biggest misconception about sword fighting is that it is all about strength. Sure, you need some physical prowess, but what really matters is technique and mental acuity. What good is brute strength if you tire yourself out after a few strikes? Training naked was also a way to condition oneself to fight in any situation. A hot summer day, a rainy winter night, in broad daylight, or under the cover of darkness. A gentleman was expected to be able to defend himself anywhere, anytime. And that meant training to fight in the same conditions. You spend several hours training in the hot sun, completely naked, and you start to understand the philosophy behind it. When you return to the safety of the classroom, you dry yourself off and prepare for the next lesson. The only sound is the squeak of your shoes on the wooden floor as you circle each other. Angelo watches intently, waiting for one of you to make a mistake. Suddenly, you launch a flurry of blows, but Isabella easily defends herself. With a flick of her wrist, she sends your sword flying across the room. Before you can even blink, she lunges forward and presses her wooden sword against your throat. She has won. Angelo immediately calls for a halt to the bout and motions for you to remove your mask. You do so, and Angelo asks you how you feel. Angry and humiliated. You tell him that you feel like killing Isabella right where she stands. He smiles and tells you that that is exactly how he wants you to feel. With that, he dismisses Isabella and motions for you to grab your sword. You return to the center of the room and draw your sword. The tip of it glistens in the firelight, catching your eye. He tells you to close your eyes and listen to the sound of your own breathing. Feel the weight of the sword in your hand and the pulse in your fingers. Only then will you be ready to fight. When you open your eyes, you see Isabella standing in front of you, her sword at the ready. He gives a signal and the bout begins. You charge forward, fueled by rage. You don't care about the rules anymore. You just want to smash in Isabella's face. But surprise, she doesn't flinch or parry. She simply lets you strike blow after blow, each one connecting solidly with her body. Eventually, you tire yourself out and lower your sword. She does the same. You both stand there panting, chests heaving up and down. Angelo waves his handkerchief and calls for the bout to be over. You remove your mask and bow to Isabella, surprised by the lack of pain in her body. Angelo congratulates you on your progress and tells you that tomorrow you will move on to the dagger. But now it is time for your reward. He leads you to a small chamber where a fire is burning merrily in the hearth. In front of it sits a beautiful young woman dressed in nothing but a thin veil. Angelo winks at you and disappears. The woman smiles at you and motions for you to sit down. Maybe being a fencer isn't so bad after all. Now, of course, this isn't how things really went down. Women weren't really allowed in the Italian fencing schools, and it is unlikely that anyone would have been rewarded with the company of a prostitute for winning a match. However, the reason for this practice is pretty simple. Most of the fencing schools were run by men who also taught their sons and other male relatives how to fight. since they were teaching family members. These masters wanted to ensure that they stayed sharp and in shape. The best way to do this was to pit them against each other in the form of mock battles. These bouts were fought with full force and were meant to test the mettle of the men. However, there were strict rules to make sure that no one actually got hurt. Over time, these rules became codified into treatises that were meant to be studied by fencing masters all over Italy. Some of these rules included the requirement to always wear a mask and to fight without armor, only using a sword in one hand. As for the prostitutes, they were likely brought in for the entertainment of the masters and their wealthy students, as well as to celebrate victories and encourage further competition between students. Of course, this practice would have been frowned upon by religious authorities. But as we all know, the church had little to no power over the Italian nobility. After all, it was during the Renaissance, when humanism was all the rage, and the old Roman ideals of virtue and honor were being rediscovered. In fact, fencing was seen as an art form and a test of one's virtue and skill. It was also seen as a way to improve oneself, physically and mentally. The Italian fencing schools were an important part of the culture of the Italian Renaissance. They provided a place for men to learn how to fight, and they also served as a place of entertainment for the wealthy Italians of the time. These schools also played an important role in the development of modern fencing. Many of the rules and techniques developed during this time period are still used today.